I've heard that the lecture last night was extraordinary, that it was brilliant, energizing, engaging, and not to be missed. And so I'm delighted to present through our dean in just a few minutes, our speaker, once again for the second of our intercultural lectures. United Seminary was founded nearly 50 years ago to be ecumenical and has been a welcoming and inclusive and friendly voice and presence in the community ever since. The intercultural theme of these lectures is what represents one of our core values. I want to ask Marguerite just to step up because she's the one who found our speaker and brought the lectures together, and thank her for that. And then if any of you are not on our mailing list and want to be on our mailing list, please pick up a card, fill it out, and put it in the basket here, and before you know it, you'll be hearing about all kinds of things coming from the seminary. So today, I wish you well as we go down this road together, this journey of intercultural and interracial understanding that's so important to building peace in our world. And now invite our dean to introduce our wonderful speaker.
Those of you who were here last night and heard that brilliant lecture have all the introduction you need. You know that today we are in the presence of a true Renaissance man. Some of you weren't here last night, though, and there is a kind of custom about academic lectures that speakers have a proper introduction. So those of you who were here last night, I ask you to bear with me. I'm going to do a traditional introduction. The Reverend Dr. Matthew Johnson was educated at Morehouse College, where he received his bachelor's degree cum laude, and at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he received an MA in Religious Studies and a PhD in Philosophical Theology. His education did not stop there. He has done a rare thing in the humanities. He has done postdoctoral work, only his postdoctoral work is in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, first at the North Carolina Institute for Psychoanalysis and more recently at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis in Washington, D.C. Along the way, he has been pastor of at least 6 churches in Illinois, North Carolina, and Georgia. 2 of those he started himself, so he is that, from the perspective of the United Church of Christ, our parent denomination, he is that extraordinarily rare thing, a new church development pastor. His current congregation is one of the 2 that he founded. He is the pastor of the Church of the Good Shepherd in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also the national director for the nonprofit organization Every Church, a Peace Church. He has taught at Morehouse College, at Spelman College, at Wake Forest University, at San Francisco Theological Seminary, and at Livingstone College, where he also was an area chair and president of the Faculty Senate. He is the author of numerous articles and essays, most notably a book, The Tragic Vision of African American Religious Experience, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and co-editing with colleagues 2 works published by Fortress Press, one, The Passion of the Lord, African American Reflections, and the most recent, Onesimus, Our Brother, Reading Religion, Race, and Slavery in Philemon. He is in wide demand as a lecturer and workshop leader in the church, in the academy, and in civil society. And if from his curriculum vitae you want an indication of just how versatile he is also the author of a novel, The Cicada's Song, which presents the content and the perspectives of his scholarly work in philosophical theology in story, which to me as an Old Testamenter is, of course, the right thing to do, because that's the way you do theology in the Bible. You tell stories. And so the Cicadas song is philosophical theology in a narrative voice. An amazing Vita and an amazing speaker. It is our real delight to welcome you, Reverend, and please join me now in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Matthew Johnson, who will address us on the topic, the poverty of prosperity theology and the spiritual impoverishment of the church.
Thank you once again for the invitation, the very warm welcome, and the very kind hospitality. Today we're going to try to leave a little more time for interaction than we did last night, since I now know how long my lecture is. It kind of dawned on me yesterday about midway through. But so today I'm going to be a little more conscious of time, and hopefully this is the kind of subject that I think deserves to be visited communally. And so we want to leave time for more interaction, question and answers. And if you have questions from last night that you want to bring up, feel free to do so. But I want to talk to you for a few moments about the some water, possibly. About the poverty of prosperity theology and the spiritual impoverishment of the church, and the black church in parentheses. But I really feel it's having an impact, of course, on all churches. But I'm going to apply it. Also, I think it's important to understand that what I'm trying to do is to apply the ideas I've been developing in other places to what is going on in the church. I think much of many of the black religionists are heading down one set of rails in discussing a black church that is increasingly invisible or non-existent. And the church is heading down another set of rails, and they're not even aware that their categories are no longer applicable to describe what's really going on a day-to-day basis in the black church. It's really sad, but they're more committed to their own particular paradigms than they tend to be to developing a paradigm that is both meaningful and explanatory at some level of what is actually going on in the African American church. And I don't think that you can be a theologian in a meaningful sense without being engaged in the church. And I know that's not a common position. People think that you have to be in the academy or the church. I think particularly in the black church that is an error. And we have many people doing black church who know little to nothing about it. We had one gentleman who was a very good scholar, Dr. Eddie Glaude, who in Nietzschean fashion proclaimed the death of the black church. The only problem is that the black church he was referring to was never alive in the first place. So I saw no reason, and many of my colleagues responded angrily. I saw no reason to respond to it because I thought it was very much a straw man. And sometimes we really don't know what we're talking about in terms of ideal constructs and what's actually going on. I don't think it's a mistake either that the last two major theological movements the world has seen were started mainly by pastors. The neo-Orthodox movement was a group of pastors. Karl Barth was a pastor. And that whole neo-Orthodox crew, liberation theologians, many of them worked with base communities. They were priests, working priests, and pastors. And I think definitely within the African American community, because of where we are in terms of the level of understanding, the complexity of the religious sensibilities and cultural reality of African America, that you have to remain very much in touch with it, to keep thinking about it and try to understand it phenomenologically, which I think is the appropriate method, phenomenology with an explanatory moment. So we're going to try to look at that, the problem of the prosperity issue from that perspective this morning. And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I would you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched, and miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked. I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, with white raiment that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of your nakedness do not appear, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. Revelations 3:14 through 19. Of the spiritual traditions of the modern world, although certainly not free from its own disturbing ambiguities, there is none greater than the African American expression of the Christian faith. This faith was forged in the crucible of traumatic suffering and proved adaptive in many ways. It has sustained us through long years of struggle. It affirmed our humanity in the face of a debilitating cultural taxonomy that defined and defines black being in consistently negative and psychologically detrimental terms. This tradition that has anchored African Americans and given the modern world the deepest, in my opinion, most spiritually resonant, aesthetically meaningful, and pleasing expression of the Christian faith is now, quite frankly, in crisis. The crisis we are currently undergoing appears at first sight as something primarily from within. As African American churches crumble and the spiritual impulse collapses under the burdensome weight of a larger culture rife with consumerist materialism. In addition, pastors, self-styled ministers, and teachers who have forsaken the discipline of the church and the rich African American tradition of preaching are correlatively preoccupied with celebrity status, fame, and fortune in the new market space of a burgeoning Christian subculture. Consequently, the spiritual integrity of the black church threatens to dissolve into the mad money-mongering of an obsessive greed normalized by a wealth-driven ethic and masked by the spiritually bankrupt rhetoric of prosperity. The crisis, which at first seems to be simply of our own making, is, however, no less tied to the ongoing siege of African America than traditional manifestations of systemic oppression. It is no less the byproduct of a racist ideology designed to uphold the privileges and normative status of all things white, particularly its, quote, Christian, end quote, heritage. White evangelical Christianity has never been comfortable with a spirituality that affirmed the reality of black suffering and pain. In the depths of the troubled American psyche, particularly in its spiritual manifestation, African American pain equals white guilt and challenges the core of a white identity built upon a sense of superiority that presupposes moral purity and supremacy. While white guilt has preoccupied much of the religious discussions of African American oppression over the years, the far more significant and deeper challenge lay in the fragile white American identity, of which their morally challenged Christianity forms an essential part. The reality of the African American experience therefore functions as a destabilizing dynamic in the core American psyche and hence engenders a variety of resistances, not the least of which is an aggressively dogged denial. The anxiety engendered by African American spiritual otherness drives a paranoid preoccupation with the African American church, intent on either transforming it into a mirror image of the white church or dismissing it as a misdirected bastardization of the standard Christian faith. In either case, the anxiety of white Christians is reduced and the threat effectively subdued. In the wake of the civil rights movement, however, the situation changed dramatically. After the movement and the emergence of black theology in the academy, the latter option became less viable in many quarters, and the spiritual power of the African American church could be safely ignored no longer. While a full analysis of the intricate web of meanings, motives, and practical implications of a current spiritual crisis in the African American church exceeds the scope of this lecture, suffice it to say that the prosperity movement and its appeal is the byproduct of our long history of internalized oppression, the fluctuating need for white validation of African American humanity and cultural forms, a failure to properly evaluate and appropriately explore the depths of our own spiritual tradition and its implications for the larger church, and finally, a concomitant theological immaturity complicated by a debilitating anti-intellectualism. When assessing the significance of the attraction of prosperity spirituality in the African American church and community, or any other for that matter, one must configure the discussion along sociocultural coordinates. One sociocultural location has a great deal to do with what is brought to prosperity theology as well as what is taken away. You may have an American of European descent sitting next to an American of African descent, and this is where we get into this new multiculturalism. That's simply another way of imposing the normativity of larger white American Christianity and a very thinly veiled attempt at assimilation and co-option of the black church and the black church resources, because black people, in many cases, tend to give liberally, and these organizations need the money to survive. All right. You can have an African American and American of European descent sitting next to each other, and they both respond positively to the prosperity message, but in reaction to a profoundly different resonance. If you consider the Christian community as a field within the larger field of American culture, you can identify many historical forces operative in the field in different ways at different points. Hence, African American Christian consciousness will be shaped by a variety of factors that give it a distinctive shape and location. Broadly conceived, it can be characterized as the consciousness of the oppressed, by virtue of its being shaped amidst asymmetrical power relations that produce a profound sense of alienation, vulnerability, marginalization, and a deeply disturbed self-representation. In fact, the reaction of African Americans to the prosperity gospel can be plotted along coordinates that give it a family resemblance to a prototypical religious manifestation of the oppressed, as different cultures encountered the West, i.e. cargo cults. Broadly conceived, cargo cults consisted of a syncretistic blend of native and European religious beliefs and practices designed to grant those among the oppressed group access to the trappings of European power, prestige, and wealth, i.e. commodities. Hence, while for whites the prosperity gospel, with its strong positive thinking motifs, played directly into their expectations, sense of entitlement, and traditional triumphalist interpretations of and identifications with the gospel and its all-powerful God, African Americans experience the prosperity gospel from a context that galvanizes access to, quote, white, end quote, wealth through the magic of prosperity principles, and hence the commodities and prestige accrued from them. In other words, its value is enhanced and complicated because of stubbornly grounded and enduring African American self-image issues. The lust for commodities is galvanized through the value that their possession and conspicuous display lend to the personhood of African Americans, so that things in this insidious atmosphere become a reflection and an affirmation of the value of their humanity and belonging. Hence the easy assimilation on the part of African American congregations of that ilk of white terms of New Age, liturgical expression, fusion spiritualities, and all too enthusiastic embracing of the repressive tolerance characteristic of so many mixed and accepting congregations. The prosperity theological movement, and repressive tolerance again refers to the kind of multiculturalism that we're looking at. It's repressive tolerance in the Marcusian sense. The prosperity theological movement makes some extravagant assertions that grate against traditional theological and scholarly claims that have a direct bearing on the fundaments of the faith. They claim, for instance, that contrary to received wisdom, Jesus was not born poor, but rich, and he remained so throughout the duration of his ministry. They back this assertion by claiming that the gifts of the wise kings or magi said to have visited Christ at his birth consisted of gold and other rare and expensive items. See Blake, 2006. In addition, they assert that the fact that Judas Iscariot is named as Christ's treasurer proves that he not only had ample finances, but so much in excess that he needed a personal accountant. Received wisdom assures us that these assertions are not only patently false, but utterly ridiculous. While there may be a tendency in some quarters of the faith to lionize those that rebel against stagnant and sometimes stifling theological tradition, this is an instance where the romanticization of rebellion cloaks the less than noble and or revolutionary motives of the movement. The only thing really radical in any of this is the extent to which the movement represents a complete capitulation of Christianity to culture and the culture of consumer capitalism. The key theological problematic of the impoverished prosperity ideology is its idolatrous commitment to the American form of consumer capitalism. Prosperity religious ideology masks the system behind a veil of religious rhetoric that shields it from the appropriate assignation of responsibility for the economic inequalities that continue to handicap African American efforts to overcome the continuing legacy of racial oppression. In other words, they give the system a pass. Put simply, the system gets a pass. By attributing to God the rather random distribution of available opportunities for African American progress, it deflects attention away from ongoing racist practices designed to destroy the integrity of African American efforts to advance themselves socially and economically. The highly stylized, prosperity-oriented religious rhetoric makes personal achievement a matter of faith narrowly defined within the context of the status quo. If one does not advance as an individual, it becomes a matter of the measure of personal faith. Even when hard work and the right value system fails to produce the results expected in a reasonably just society, then not the system, but your faith or lack thereof becomes the blame. And of course, this covers a whole history of the failure of the implementation of the traditional value system that America proclaims on the part of blacks to lead to the results it was supposed to lead to because of the way the opportunities were circumscribed and the communities were terrorized. All throughout the period of Jim Crow, if blacks appeared to be successful and to be making it according to the value system of hard work and virtue that was proclaimed in the South, they would be summarily hung, smacked before wearing a tie on a sidewalk in public, or for speaking too properly. And this is going right on up to the late 70s, I know, when I had to ride around the county of Brunswick in Virginia with a shotgun on the back seat of my car because under threat of being the victim of perhaps some violence because of a protest I led there in the community. That was in 79. And when I returned last year to do a revival in my hometown, it hadn't changed very much at all. And that was just only one experience. I could give you countless others. So in other words, this myth of American progress on race relations has been really unfortunate, and it has really led to a lot of confusion. We really need to have a discussion on what progress really means. I mean, we've gotten rid of some culturally cumbersome things like signs for colored and white only, but they have been replaced surreptitiously with other forms and practices that continue to reinforce the status quo of white entitlement and supremacy in America. So anyway, so we can have that discussion later if you'd like. All right. Hence, where we should be focused as a collective on the availability of opportunity, systemic injustice and systematic marginalization of African Americans and other poor people in the distribution process, the focus is rather on the atomized self. Quote, "It is your fault because all you need is more faith in God and you will succeed," end quote. And it really creates something of a catch-22 within the black religious tradition, because you don't want to say that faith in God doesn't work, all right, because that sounds and feels heretical. And so it's a kind of malicious moral blackmail or extortion. It's a kind of moral, spiritual extortion going on with prosperity theology in terms of how it works psychologically. At least I think that case can be made. You don't question God's ability to deliver, do you? That becomes the catch-22 of spiritual entrapment, ensuring the insularity of the system against legitimate prophetic critique and transformative spiritual praxis. Whereas the system should be critiqued, it is instead masked behind religious rhetoric of faith and blessings. And God becomes the fail-safe legitimation for the inherent injustice and inequalities of systemic oppression, thereby making God an accomplice to the subversion of his own will. This, I think, is blasphemous. In addition, the capitalist system becomes God in prosperity ideology, rendering it idolatrous and heretical at its core. While we must emphasize God as the fountain of every true blessing, we must never forget that the vessels through which the blessings come often divert God's intention. The church is there to correct this perversion of God's will. The emphasis on faith, precipitating material prosperity, is an ideological genuflection before the golden calf of commodity production, as true praise follows and is inspired by conspicuous consumption. The true nature of the prosperity divinity is disclosed in the supplanting of the cross by the dollar sign as its central symbol, replete with the power to inspire new levels of uncritical loyalty, elevated expectation, and praise for its many benefits, even from the mouths of some of its most abject adherents. Prosperity theology encourages African American internalization of white America's denial of our ongoing oppression and pervasive pain. That is important. I'm going to say that again. Prosperity ideology encourages African American internalization of white America's denial of our ongoing oppression and pervasive pain. I really see this in Atlanta. This tendency is pathogenic and encourages an irresponsible mishandling of reality. It is a truism that any problem must be recognized before it can be resolved. Denying its existence is never more than a postponement of an inevitable conflict. Prosperity-based spirituality is an inauthentic spirituality that reduces religion to wish fulfillment and illusion. The thinly veiled positive thinking masquerading as theology or legitimate Christian doctrine, as more African American pastors try to broaden their popular appeal by mimicking in substance as well as form the methods of motivational speakers, cannot and will not lift or liberate the masses of black people. It simply will not happen. Instead, it is turning many African Americans who identify as Christians into nothing more than cheap inspiration junkies, as the need to stoke the fires of illusion escalate in the face of the recalcitrant shortcomings of morally and spiritually bankrupt economic and social systems. Here, I think it is important to point out that the manipulative liturgical methods often employed by those in the prosperity movement are a reflection of the spiritually empty and flat traditions they truly emerged from. Noisy worship services are not synonymous with an authentically African American worship experience. In fact, the need to orchestrate response in worship emerged from white evangelicals attempting to mimic black worship services. Our worship experience was never a spiritual pep rally designed to incite people to a blind faith in a repressive social system. It was instead an outpouring from the depth of our endurance, our longing and determination to forge ahead through God in the face of what we knew was there. The larger society reduced our worship to a simplistic interpretation of a happy Negro who could not be deeply damaged because there wasn't really enough humanity there to hurt in the first place. I am afraid that the spirituality of the prosperity movement borders on making African Americans a caricature of themselves, like a black man wearing blackface as a prerequisite of acceptance and the right to entertain. From Hollywood to hip-hop and the Holy Rollers, we are suddenly learning how to be black from the people who have understood us the least. Moreover, the preoccupation with worldly goods at the expense of spiritual health and salvation is a blatant corruption of the gospel of Christ. Was it not Christ himself who said, "A man's life or a human's life is not measured by the abundance of their possessions"? In fact, Jesus' message was that wealth was neither a prerequisite for nor necessarily an indication of God's favor. Material prosperity does not carry its own source of moral justification, and it is no indication of spiritual health. It is contrary to the scriptures and blatantly heretical to even imply such a thing. Everyone is not intended to be rich, nor need they be. God does will that everyone, however, be whole. Whether or not wealth is evil in and of itself is an entirely different question. In fact, wealth may be by and large neutral if reasonable and obtained by morally legitimate means, as which I won't speculate on what they are, it's a whole other discussion. As Christian leaders, we must continue to stress that point, as did our Lord. There are means of obtaining wealth that may be perfectly legal, and at the same time, quite immoral. It might be legal, for instance, to call in a mortgage on a house based upon a technicality, but Jesus found those that devour widows' houses, then prayed long pretentious prayers, morally reprehensible. Wealth, therefore, is not the enemy, evil is. There is nothing wrong with pastors becoming reasonably wealthy if their gifts and hard work have made them so. It is an abomination, however, to pervert the gospel to become so and then twist the message of Christ to justify it. I remember as a young pastor listening, I won't call his name because y'all know who he is, listening to a frustrating conversation an older, well-respected pastor, who is now a professor, was having concerning an issue of great consequence for the collective well-being of the community he served. Having hung up the phone, he turned to me and commented that if they just prayed me for the stress and strain, I'd be a wealthy man. Stress and strain was not the word that he used. I'll leave that to your imaginations. Great spiritual traditions are born and later defined and refined in the crucible of crisis. The personal crisis of Gautama Siddhartha, precipitated by his encounter with old age, disease, death, and finally monastic withdrawal, led to the Enlightenment and the founding of the Buddhist tradition that continues to flourish today. The ethical crisis of the Arab people, precipitated by immoral idolatry, disorganization, fratricidal tribal predation, and the mishandling of women, moved Muhammad to seek and discover the one true God on behalf of his people. The murder of Jesus could have led to the wholesale disintegration of the kingdom movement, and almost did, until the disciples, rallied by the Spirit, proclaimed him Christ and gave birth to the church. Even within the framework of these great traditions and different spiritual traditions altogether, various movements and expressions have faded, failed, or utterly disappeared because they lacked either the resources, the requisite will in the leadership, or resolve to respond appropriately and creatively to a crisis. Crises are defining moments. They can precipitate the crystallization of a great spiritual tradition, but failure to respond to them creatively and resolutely may well consign it to the dustbin of history, either to be retrieved one day or perhaps forever lost. What our forebears bequeathed to us was born in the agonizing throes of a tortured labor and nurtured through the painful trauma of inconsolable grief and irretrievable loss. Yet, like the antidote drawn from the serpent's venom, our purifying spirituality emerged from the poison of our oppression, and in it there is healing for all the church and perhaps yet the world. Should we fail to recognize the greatness of our God-given gift or plumb the depth of this vast sea, which may yet be our most valuable cultural treasure, then we are indeed poor, miserable, naked, and blind. The magisterial spirituality of the African American church is indeed gold tried in the fire of affliction, and like the pearl of great price, is to be prized above all earthly possessions. If this generation of African Americans fails to recognize, hold fast, and affirm what our forebears simply took for granted, then indeed we are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. T.S. Eliot. Thank you.